Salvete, viatores, and welcome back to Let's Translate Eutropius Breviarium Historiae Romanae ab Orbe Condita. Last time we read about the military tribunes once again, and their end, and how they really did not last very long. Though Eutropius makes it sound like they lasted a far shorter time than they actually did. So read Livy if you want the whole thing, but yeah, eventually the consuls did come back. This time, to make up for the kind of lack of super interesting grammar, we are going to go much more into the grammar here, since we only have a couple sentences to do for the chapter. But without further ado, let us begin. Lucio Genucio et quinto Servilios consulibus mortus est Camillus. So, Lucio Genucio et quinto Servilio consulibus, ablative absolute. So, when Lucius Genucius and Quintus Servilius were consuls, mortus est Camillus. Camillus died. Perfect passive participle, by the way, with mortus est. Honor, subject. And Camillus is technically the subject of this sentence, but there's no verb, it's just mortus est, which is, I guess, technically modifying Camillus? I don't know. I'm going to go into that in a minute. Honor, our subject here, A, post Romulum secundus stellatus est. So, an honor, A is the dative form of Isea id, so an honor to him, for him, post Romulum, after Romulus, secundus stellatus est. So, stellatus est, perfect passive participle again, but what was it? Granted? Yeah, granted to him. An honor was granted to him. Second, this is like, would this be an apposition to honor? It's also in the nominative. I think that's how it works. But an honor was granted to him, him being Camillus, second after Romulus. The Romans loved Camillus. But I want to focus on something else. I want to focus more on the grammar right now, because this tiny little chapter did not take long to get through, and I want to, I guess, extrapolate on some of the grammar that is in this chapter specifically, since, it's so short. I want to talk about participles and ablative absolutes. Participles are adjectives that are formed from verbs, or verbal adjectives. Despite their verbal heritage, they still modify nouns they agree with in gender, number, and case, just like adjectives. However, they also carry over some aspects from their verb counterparts, so they still have tense and voice. There are 4 types of participles in Latin, depending on their tense and voice. First, we have the present active participle. You form these by taking the present stem, basically the infinitive minus re, and adding an s or nt, and then the appropriate third declension ending. These are the only participles that decline with the third declension. The rest decline like other adjectives with the first or second declension endings depending on the corresponding noun's gender. You can recognize these participles by looking for either an s in the nominative or nt in the other cases. These are describing what the noun is doing during the main action and are translated with the ending ing. Amans, loving, mitens, sending, and so on. Just remember, despite them being formed from verbs, they are still acting as adjectives. So, amans vir is the loving man, instead of the man loves. Deponent verbs become participles in the exact same way, and are translated the same too, since they already have active meanings despite looking passive. Next, we have future active participles. These are formed using the 4th principal part stem, this part right here in dictionary definitions, which most students probably ignore. Totally not me. Plus UR, plus the appropriate first or second declension ending. So look for UR, and you'll know the word is a future active participle. These are describing what the noun is about to do, is going to do, intends to do, etc. It's going to happen after the main action of the sentence. So, doctorus, about to teach, auditoros, intending to hear, so on and so forth. Just use your best judgment for how you translate them. The context can change how they should be translated into English. Deponent verbs, once again, become participles and are translated just like the regular verbs. Now we have future passive participles, also known as gerundives. These are formed using the present stem, same as the present active participle, but with nd plus the first or second declension endings. You see that nd? You're about to be future passive participled. These are describing what will happen to the noun, so something is about to be or is to be. So, capiendos, about to be captured, admirandos, to be admired. Future passive participles of deponent verbs, exactly the same. Once again, don't worry about that. Here's the big one, the one we really care about. Perfect passive participles. We've seen these plenty, but let me properly explain what they do and how they should be translated. These are formed using the fourth principal part plus the ending. No weird addition, just the stem plus the first or second declension ending. Simple. So if you don't see any of the signs of the other participles, you've got a perfect passive one. However, oftentimes a form of the word sum, esse, or to be, comes right after the participle. Not always, but sometimes. Latin authors like to omit the form of esse a lot, so keep an eye out mainly for the main form, rather than est. As the name implies, these describe what happened to the noun before the main action of the sentence. So, amisus is after being lost, or opressos is having been oppressed. Having been blanked is the most literal translation of the perfect passive participle, but there's usually a more natural way to translate it, so feel out what feels best in the context of the passage. Hold on, I hear you exclaim. We didn't translate the perfect passive participle like that in this sentence. It's translated almost exactly how it's written, with est as was and delatos as granted. Very true. This is because they can also be translated more exactly as the words are on their own, if that makes sense. You've got est for is, or really was, since perfect tense, and delatos as granted. Now, why would you use the perfect passive participle instead of the regular verb's perfect passive form? Well, that's because the perfect passive form of verbs doesn't exist in Latin. It's not there. You see a conjugation table and it's just the perfect passive participle. So, if it sounds right in translation, just treat it kind of like a regular verb. Just remember, like grammatically, it is not a verb, but a verbal adjective. So it's describing what has happened to something more similarly to an adjective rather than a verb. So the most literal translation would still treat it as an adjective. But in English, sometimes it may just sound better as a perfect passive verb. Again, it just depends on the context and what you think will sound best in English. Now, perfect passive participles formed from deponent verbs are actually different. They look exactly the same as the standard forms, but they are translated active, not passive. And they say perfect active participles don't exist. They're right there. They just don't have their own forms. In fact, mortos est is an example of this. Other than that, they're formed the exact same way. Just, again, translated active. And that's all the different forms of participles. The most common that we see in Eutropius is the perfect passive, but always keep an eye out for other forms. Although there is another common use for participles outside of their main use. Now, ablative absolutes, or ablatives absolute. The former sounds better, so I'll stick to that. Ablative absolutes are phrases entirely in the ablative case that are completely separate, or absolute, from the grammar of the rest of the sentence. They are formed one of three ways. The first and most common is with a noun and a participle, both in the ablative case, of course. We have an example of this in Book 1, Chapter 2, Commotis Bellis, the war having been commenced. The next is with two nouns, which we have an example of right here, Lucio Genucio et Quintus Silverio consulibus, while Lucius Genucius and Quintus Silverius were consuls. The third way is with a noun and an adjective. I couldn't find an example of this in Book 1 or 2 of this Breviarium, but an example of this from the poet Martial is Salvo Marone, while Maro was alive or Maro being alive. Ablative absolutes can serve many purposes and are translated kind of like one of many dependent clauses. One is temporal, so when the action occurs, like with this clause right here. The action is occurring while these two are consuls, or during their consulship, you could also say. Another is causal, or why the action is occurring, like with the sentence Bruto et Cassio caesis, nulla iam publica arma. Brutus and Cassius having been killed, or if you want to make it more obvious as causal, because Brutus and Cassius were killed, there were no longer public arms. There is also concessive, or opposition. So like, although the action happens. So, consisterent in acie, non pugnaturis militibus. They could stand in battle array, although the soldiers would not fight. Ablative absolutes can also be conditional, divis volentibus, if the gods are willing, or with the gods willing. There's also circumstantial, so with this thing happening, the action happens. Inde domum repetes toto comitante senato. Then you will return home, while all the Senate follows. The most general way to translate the ablative absolute is with the noun participling. So, like how I translated the phrase in this chapter earlier, with Lucius and Quintus being consuls. However, each use of the ablative absolute could be translated in a better, more distinct way. Here we can translate this phrase, because it is temporal, as, again, I've said before, during the consulship of Lucius and Quintus, or while Lucius and Quintus were consul. So as I'm sure you can see, ablative absolutes are kind of just an everything grammatical construction. They do so much while being formed in the exact same way. It's kind of neat, but also kind of frustrating, because you see, many ablatives just in a row. This must be an ablative absolute. But what exactly is it doing here? What is it trying to get across, and how am I supposed to translate it? Because, so many options. It could be a little difficult to get used to, but that's part of why Eutropius and Caesar's De Bello Gallico are good for this. They use ablative absolutes so much, you have no choice but to get a bunch of experience with them. Since ablative absolutes are also common, it's still pretty easy to get used to them. Like, I already quoted like Martial and Tacitus here, so they're everywhere. So it shouldn't take you too long to get used to them, since you'll be seeing them so often. But Eutropius and Caesar are the ones that use it the most in my experience. I'm sure there are others that use them plenty, but from what I know, Eutropius and Caesar, so many ablative absolutes. Well, I hope I explained participles and ablative absolutes better than before. Let's get back to Eutropius with a super quick Latin and English reading. Lucio Genucio et Quintus Silvilio consulibus mortus est Camillus. Honor e post Romulum secundus delatus est. During the consulship of Lucius Genucius and Quintus Silvius, Camillus died. An honor was granted to him second after Romulus. Next time, the Gauls invade Rome again. Thanks, Camillus, for not actually ending the threat. And in the next couple episodes, we get to see the origin of a couple cognomina, like special cognomina. So, look forward to that. Valete, viatores.